In 1911, across the entire Pacific Ocean, fewer than 2,000 sea otters remained. This small animal, often seen floating on its back and using rocks to crack open its food, seemed far too harmless to decide the fate of an ocean. But when sea otters disappeared, the kelp forests began to fade, and the seafloor was taken over by sea urchins, turning it into a cold, silent purple wasteland. What made it even more disturbing was that people barely noticed the disaster, because over generations, they had become used to seeing the ocean in that damaged state. Then, when sea otters slowly returned, everything began to reverse. Kelp started growing again, sea urchin numbers dropped, and fish and other marine life that had been missing for decades began coming back. Scientists later discovered something even more shocking. Kelp forests with sea otters could store far more carbon, an impact compared to removing millions of cars from the road every year. But how could one small animal pull an entire ecosystem back from the edge of silence? Before they were hunted to the edge of extinction, the Pacific waters along California were once one of the most vibrant marine ecosystems on Earth. Vast kelp forests stretched from Baja California all the way to Alaska, with some stalks reaching 175 feet high, even taller than a 15-story building. Inside that green underwater world, countless marine species found shelter, hunting grounds, and nursery space, from rockfish and sea lions to gray whales and hundreds of tiny creatures living around the kelp holdfasts. And quietly keeping the entire system in balance were the sea otters. Then the fur trade arrived. Because sea otters have one of the densest coats of any mammal, they became a major target for hunters across the Pacific. From 1741 to 1911, about 1 million sea otters were killed. Once this predator disappeared, sea urchins were no longer controlled. Their numbers exploded, they devoured the kelp, and the seafloor was transformed into silent urchin barrens. If you had lived back then and watched the kelp forest disappear little by little, do you think you would have realized the real cause was the loss of sea otters? Comment your answer below, because the next part will show how scientists took many years to understand what was really happening. In 1938, a small colony of sea otters, only about 50 animals, was unexpectedly discovered near Big Sur. It was almost the last trace of the species along the California coast. After the Marine Mammal Protection Act of 1972 was passed, they finally had a chance to recover slowly. But one major question still had no clear answer. Were sea otters simply animals that lived inside kelp forests, or were they the very force keeping those forests alive? Biologist James Estes began searching for the answer in the Aleutian Islands, where some waters still had sea otters and others had none at all. He and his research team dove into freezing water, counted otters, counted sea urchins, and measured kelp density along fixed underwater survey lines. The work continued season after season under harsh conditions, but the pattern became harder and harder to ignore. In places without sea otters, sea urchins covered the seafloor, and kelp nearly disappeared. But in places with sea otters, urchins were held back, and kelp forests grew tall and dense like underwater cities. In 1974, Estes published his first findings in Science. At first, many scientists were skeptical because it seemed difficult to believe that one small animal could control an entire ecosystem. But the data kept repeating with striking consistency, and in the end, the ocean gave its own answer. As the California sea otter population slowly increased, the change was no longer just something written in research data. Marine biologists began seeing it directly beneath the surface. In areas that had once been covered by sea urchins, young kelp started rising from the seafloor. At first, they appeared only in small scattered patches, but over time, those patches expanded, connected, and slowly turned back into green underwater forests. Life returned with the kelp. Fish species that had been missing from survey records for decades, such as lingcod, black rockfish, and cabezon, began appearing again. Harbor seals came back to old resting sites, and seabirds started nesting near the kelp line once more. But what divers remembered most was not only the sight, but the sound. Places that had once felt silent like a dead sea now crackled, clicked, and hummed with thousands of tiny creatures. It was the sound of an ecosystem coming back to life. In 2012, Chris Wilmers, James Estes, and their collaborators published a finding that pushed the sea otter story far beyond marine ecology. After combining 40 years of kelp forest data from Vancouver Island to the Western Aleutians, they realized that wherever sea otters kept sea urchins under control, kelp forests grew stronger and absorbed far more carbon. In areas with sea otters, kelp forests could produce several times more carbon than areas without them. The total impact was equal to adding millions of tons of stored carbon, almost like removing 3 to 6 million cars from the road every year. What made this even more surprising was that before this, the role of sea otters had barely appeared in ocean climate models. But the return of sea otters was not welcomed by everyone. Because they can eat 20 to 25% of their body weight every day, sea otters became direct competitors for fishermen harvesting abalone, crabs, clams, and sea urchins. In 1987, the United States created a no-otter zone south of Point Conception, but the relocation plan failed. Many otters died or simply swam back. By 2012, the program was officially ended. Today, California sea otters number only about 3,000, still far below their historical population. They also face climate change, parasitic disease, and marine heat waves that weaken kelp forests. The final lesson is that when humans remove even one small link, the consequences can spread through an entire ecosystem for decades. Sea otters did not rebuild the kelp forests by themselves. They simply stopped the force destroying them, giving the ocean a chance to recover. If you found this story interesting, hit like, subscribe, and comment below which other small animal you think could change an entire ecosystem like the sea otter.